What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you our Kineticist build for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. So I've committed to making a build for each class in the game, kind of just sharing how I personally would approach and play that class. Now that said, each of these builds will come with a recommendation for the difficulty, and for this particular build that difficulty is Core. Now that said, the Kineticist is a very high damage class and is very capable of doing unfair difficulty, and with this you could probably even push into hard if you wanted to. However, I will say that for unfair difficulty I would actually probably run an Elemental Engine build as opposed to Blood Kineticist, but Blood Kineticist is new. I think it's pretty interesting, and personally I play it and have a lot of fun on core difficulty, but again, you could probably push into hard fairly safely as long as you have a good team composition. But with that out of the way, let's jump into it. Now we're going to walk through character creation first. Obviously we pick the Blood Kineticist archetype for the Kineticist. Now we're not going to be multi-classing into anything because Kineticists in general don't multi-class particularly very well because of how they get their damage, which doesn't stack with any other class in a particularly great fashion. Not to say it's impossible, but it's just more of a pain than it's worth. So next up, our race. So personally, I like to pick Kitsune for this. That is because we need Dex and Constitution. However, no race perfectly aligns with the bonuses that we need. Nothing actually gives you directly Dexterity and Constitution. So really what you need to do is pick something that gives you one of those and then potentially adjust your modifiers to give you the other one. So with Kitsune, you can pick the regular Kitsune Heritage, which will give you a +2 to Dexterity and a +2 to Charisma and a -2 to Strength. We're not using Strength and we're not using Charisma. So what we're going to wind up doing is actually taking that Charisma bonus and taking it all the way down as far as we can, because we're not going to use that at all as a Blood Kineticist. And we're going to put the points we get from that back into Constitution. But we'll get to that in a second. So for our background, personally, I like River Kingdom's Daredevil under the regional backgrounds. Now, if you are unaware, if you pick a background that gives things that you are already proficient in, for instance, mobility as a class skill, then that background will actually give you a bonus to that thing instead. So instead of getting mobility as a class skill, we instead get a +1 to our mobility. But moreover, what we're really picking this for is the +2 bonus to AC against attacks of opportunity. Because Kineticists don't use traditional weapons, they're only proficient in light armor, your options for backgrounds are a little limited. And as such, I personally find this one to be the most useful, simply because of that +2 bonus to AC against attacks of opportunity. If you're unaware, Kineticists can be a little bit of a glass cannon, so having that extra AC as we move our cannon around the battlefield and potentially invoke attacks of opportunity can be very useful, because we do need to move our character quite a bit to get in range to use our various blasts, which we'll get into. But personally, I'd recommend River Kingdom's Daredevil. That said, any background that gives you a bonus to the things you want is really not going to hurt at all. For instance, if you want to get something that gives you light armor proficiency, which we already have, thus giving you a +1 to your AC in general, is also a decent way to go. Next up, we have our ability scores. Now, as I mentioned, we need Dex and Constitution. We're going to take Dexterity up to the maximum right off the bat. Now, I would not recommend taking points away from Intelligence or Wisdom. Intelligence, if we drop it any lower, we won't get our 2 skill points per level, which, while not strictly necessary, I just personally don't enjoy. Because this way, and with Kineticists in general, they're very good at maxing out like 2 skills to the point where they can do those things better than almost anybody. And by like level 20, it's very easy to get like +40 or +50 in a skill with a Kineticist. And because of that, I don't like to drop Intelligence. Wisdom, I don't like to drop because it is going to drop our will saves. And if you're unaware, Kineticists already have a low will save, so dropping that even more is just undesirable. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to take all the points we can away from Charisma, because unless you're just wanting to use Persuasion as your main character, it doesn't do us much good, and we're not using magic devices. Having that Kitsune background that gives us points to Charisma allows us to take away from it without giving ourselves any serious detriments nonetheless, because again, no racial background actually gives us the exact stat spread that we need, so we're kind of going to do this to compensate. And we're going to put all those points back into Constitution. So you should wind up with about a +5 to your Dex and a +3 roughly to your Constitution, depending on how exactly you spread this. Next up, we have our skills. Personally, for this build, I like to pick Mobility and Perception, because that's what we're going to have big bonuses in, and Perception is very important. We also already have party members that can give you trickery and stealth, and they are very good at it. But that said, stealth as a class skill would be the way to go if you don't want to pick perception. Persuasion I wouldn't recommend just because we don't really have the charisma for it, as I mentioned. And then use magic device isn't really super helpful for us, but if you wanted to, I suppose you could in fact do that. Personally though, mobility and perception. And that brings us to feats. So kineticists and feats are a little weird, but level 1 is always point blank shot for this build, period. And level 2 and level 3, I also have a very hard, like, this is what you need to pick choice. After that, you have some wiggle room. For level 1, point blank shot. For level 3, you need precise shot. Those two are incredibly important because we're going to be making a ton of ranged attack rolls with this build. And if you want to hit anything, those two are basically mandatory. Then we have our elemental focus. As a kineticist, this is only available to be the water element. And then everything else in character creation is cosmetic and non-important. Alright, so now we're going to talk feats and some other stuff like that. So for starters, feats. Beyond those first three, you actually do have a little bit of room to wiggle with this because of the way kineticists kind of interact with feats. Now, if you're interested, I made a whole video about kineticists very broadly, not just this specific type, that explains a lot more of this in a bit more detail. But overall, the three major ones that you need to pick up right off the bat are, as I mentioned, point blank shot, precise shot, and then at level 3, weapon focus, kinetic blast. This is going to give us a +1 bonus on all of our attack rolls that we make, because again, we're going to be making physical attack rolls, so we need that as high as possible, because if you're unaware, kineticists are a bit of a nuke, actually. They only get one attack in this particular build per round for most of the game. That can potentially change depending on your mythic pass. It's actually possible to attack 2 targets later. Basically, we need to make sure that one gigantic hit hits as often as humanly possible. Because of that, weapon focus, kinetic blast. Now, after that, though, you actually have some room to maneuver. Personally, I don't like to use deadly aim, which gives you more damage, but a detriment to your chance to hit or your attack roll. So because of that, I wouldn't recommend using that, though you can. Things like improved critical for your kinetic blast are a great way to go. Improved precise shot is very good. That'll allow your ranged attacks to ignore anything but total concealment and cover, which again, for us, just helps us hit things more often. And you can pick up things like, say, dodge or light armor focus to give yourself a little more AC if you want, so you can take a few more hits. But the most important ones, I would say, again, are point blank shot, precise shot, weapon focus, kinetic blast, as well as improved precise shot, which is going to be most of your feat choices right there. And then I like to pick up things like improved critical myself, just because we can in fact double the critical range of our kinetic blasts, which just helps us push through more damage should we so choose. From there, let's talk about our wild talents. There is one that I would recommend getting immediately at level 2, which is when you get your first wild talent. So if you're unaware, wild talents are just like extra feats and general utility that a kineticist will get as they level up. At level 2, you'll get your first one, and I recommend you pick up the feat Blind Fight through your talents. This is because this is probably the only one of your wild talents that is specifically combat changing in some way. Again, most of it is just utility, like heal spells, restoration spells. You can even get the grease spell, for instance. But a lot of it's just like spell-like abilities that in general is more utility than anything else. But Blind Fight, while it's not going to give us any advantages in melee, it will cause an invisible attacker to not get any advantages to hitting us in melee. That is to say, we won't lose our dexterity bonus to armor class, they don't get the +2 bonus for being invisible, and while we can still be hit in range this way, we are also given immunity to gaze attacks. Gaze attacks are special attacks used by higher level monsters, and is just generally very useful. Now afterwards, you can really pick up whatever you want as far as the wild talents go. Personally, I like to use like skill focus and stuff. The kinetic healer one is very good, which will allow you to use your class's burn mechanic instead of a spell slot or anything like that to heal yourself. And there's just a lot of utility otherwise for this build. Showing you guys some kind of mid-game gameplay here, we're going to go over a few things real quick. Again, I cover a lot of this way more in depth in my How to Play a Kineticist build, so we're just going to cover this very briefly and kind of how it actually works in combat. Kineticists operate on a mechanic called burn. Basically, every time they use their kinetic blast, they can alter their kinetic blast in a variety of ways that then cost them burn. Burn causes your character to take non-lethal, non-healable damage, which is what makes them a glass cannon despite having Constitution as a primary ability. Now, as you gain burn, you also gain benefits through a mechanic called elemental overflow that you will start getting at level 3. This means the more burn you have, You're going to get bonuses to your attack and damage, as well as your ability scores. Specifically at 3 burn, at level 6, you can actually give yourself a +2 to Dex and Constitution, which is super handy. Now, as you level up, that increases farther. In general, this build, depending on where you are in game, you're going to want to hover around 3 to potentially up to about 6 burn later in the game, because this is going to give us great benefits from elemental overflow. On top of that, we get some very specific infusions as a blood kineticist. Most kineticists get to choose infusions for their blast. Infusions alter that blast in some way, so while our regular blasts are a ranged attack roll, that can be changed to a variety of effects actually. Now for blood kineticists, we're going to keep it fairly simple. For the first infusion, which is one of the only ones you get to pick throughout like half of the game, I recommend you pick up extended range so we can hit things from farther away. Beyond that, blood kineticist is going to give you 2 very early on that are pretty useful. You get Rack. Rack is overall kind of meh damage-wise. It does about half damage on a successful save. However, that damage is untyped and unresistible, meaning that it will always go through as long as you hit the target, which can be useful by itself. And then later on, we pick up Bleeding Infusion. Bleeding Infusion, when combined with one of your blasts, forces the target to make a fortitude save. If they fail it, they take bleed damage, which can be very effective, especially early game. Later on, we get stuff like Gut-Wrenching Infusion, which can make your target sick when you hit them. Now, later on, like around level 13, 15, you will be able to pick up some more infusions that will allow you to do things like make your kinetic blast a cone and stuff. Overall, there, you can just kind of pick whatever floats your boat. Now, for your level 7 extra element, you are actually forced to take water a second time, which gives you your actual blood blast. Before that, we're just using Water Blast, which deals physical damage. Blood Blast also only deals physical damage, though the tooltip will tell you that it uses electricity damage. That is not true. It only deals physical damage, meaning you do not need to pick up Ascendant Element with this. But those are kind of the basics of what we're going to be doing attack-wise. We're going to be using Gathering Power, toggling those infusions as necessary, and then attacking our target with our big nuke attack. Now, Blood Kineticist, because we chose water, will also give us the Water Shroud ability. Now, when you pick this up early on, it's actually going to give you 3 different abilities, which can be a little confusing. It's going to give you the option to use one of those 3 to increase your burn, to increase the effect of Shroud of Water, which is to increase your AC. And then the other 2 are toggle abilities on either your armor or your shield. And toggling those will give you the appropriate Shroud of Water bonus to either your armor or a shield bonus to your AC instead. Personally, I always go shield because we can wear light armor, and if we pick the armor bonus, those 2 bonuses conflict and do not stack. Whereas if you pick a shield bonus, because we're not using a shield, we get that full bonus. This will give you some extra AC just because you have water as a blood kineticist. I want to mention some general tips and stuff as far as things to do just in game before we actually kind of go over some general combat. For starters, mythic abilities. For your first 2 levels as a mythic hero before you actually pick your path, I would recommend either Azada or the Close to the Heavens. So Close to the Heavens or the Azada variant, which I believe is called like Freedom or something like that. Because those 2 mythic hero options are going to give you a ray attack that uses your ranged attack roll with a much bigger range than your actual base kinetic blast. Plus, they're a standard action, which is going to allow you to move, not have to use Gather Power to lower the burn cost of your blasts, and then use that ray attack, which will then benefit from all of your ranged attack roll bonuses. Now, for the actual mythic ability, I recommend Kinetic Overcharge. Kinetic Overcharge is going to increase the amount of burn that using Gather Power reduces, which overall can be highly effective. Now, when you get to the first act in Canabras, you actually want to talk to Anivia and the tavern's innkeeper about extra locations in the city that you can explore. The reason being that one of those locations, Topaz Solutions or something like that, the one closest to Defender's Heart, actually has an enemy that will drop a kinetic diadem, which for an early game kineticist is amazing. It just flat out increases the damage dice of your kinetic blast, which is ridiculous. Next up, Mythic Pass. We're going to talk about that real quick. The one I recommend the most is Azada. Now that said, there's not necessarily a wrong choice here. Most of them will work. Lich is a popular option for kineticists, though with this particular build I would not recommend Lich, simply because of your Constitution modifier. When you become an actual Lich towards the end of the game, that will mess up a lot of your stuff because it will not change your Kineticist abilities to operate off of Charisma. That may or may not get fixed later, but right now it does not work. So because of that, overall, I recommend Azada because Kineticist will actually fully benefit from basically everything that the Azada mythic path has to offer. That is to say the superpowers, the dragon companion, the bard song type stuff. You can use all of that as a Kineticist to its full effect. If you use some of the superpowers, you can do some pretty crazy stuff with your kinetic blasts, as a lot of that actually does affect them. For instance, it's possible to permanently haste yourself, which is useful for movement. And overall, I think the Azada is just the most useful. In game, I would highly suggest Gold Dragon, because Gold Dragon also just gives a ton of benefits that the Kineticist can actually benefit from. But again, there is not technically a wrong choice, and every mythic path does have something that you can use. All that out of the way, let's talk some actual combat and how that's going to work for you. So this is about level 10 in average equipment. Nothing crazy, just stuff we've picked up along the way throughout the game. We are on core difficulty here. So our general setup is going to be using Gather Power Low, which is going to be just a move action, but it's going to reduce our kinetic blast burn by quite a bit. We're going to be using Blood Blast with our bleeding infusion to push for more bleed damage, ideally. However, you can, of course, toggle those infusions around. Now, personally, I always recommend playing a Kineticist on turn-based so you can effectively toggle your infusions per blast per turn, which really helps you manage what they are doing. On top of this, we also get Metakinesis as a Blood Kineticist, which I haven't really mentioned up to this point, but Blood Kineticist will get the regular Metakinesis that all Kineticists get. That is to say, Empowered, Maximized, and Quicken. Basically, for accepting more burn, your character can use those types of meta magic feats. Provided, of course, you can either accept that burn or reduce it to the point where you can use it anyway, which can overall be very effective, provided you can, again, mitigate the burn to a level that is acceptable. But overall here, our character is just going to use Gather Power as our move action, which can limit your movement a little bit, but if you need to move, you can either use a blast without using Gather Power, which will cost you some burn points for sure, or you can use a move action and then either the Close to Heavens or the Instrument of Freedom ability that I recommended from your Mythic Paths to shoot a similar ranged attack and still push some damage through and kind of reposition yourself on the battlefield, or you can use the extended range infusion that I mentioned earlier. Now, here on core difficulty, a regular attack with our average equipment, our kinetic diadem and things, is going to deal about 12 die 6, give or take. Now that's going to equal out to be, with our modifiers, around 50 to 60 damage on average for a regular hit. Now, theoretical maximum, our Blood Blast could potentially hit up for about 90. Now that said, with a critical, on average I tend to hit about 100 to 150, again at like level 10 here. On that note, again, a critical theoretical maximum, you could push that up at level 10 to potentially even like 200. Though on average, it's going to be between 100 and 150 in my experience. So there you go, guys. Overall, just a fun Kineticist build. I've personally found it very effective on core difficulty especially. So I hope you enjoyed the build. If you guys do, by all means, let me know about it in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.